Thank you very much for the introductions, and thank you very much for inviting me here. As you said, it's not my first time in Georgia by a long way, and it's not even my first time in Tbilisi State University. I've spoken here before. You probably know that the main reason for my being here is as a juror on the European Union Journalism Prizes, which are being awarded tomorrow evening. And I've been asked to extend an invitation to you, to anybody who would like to attend the awards, which are tomorrow evening at the Rooms Hotel at 7:30. You all are most welcome. Just one personal anecdote from that. It's given me the opportunity to read, view, and listen to a great deal of work by young Georgian journalists. And I can tell you how honestly how impressed I am to see the standard of journalism in Georgia, which is so different from when I first came here 12 years ago. And I mean, it's not just the style of writing or crafting a good piece of reporting, it's also the subject matter, the topics that are being written about today. And I will tell you, when I worked with Georgian Public Broadcasting, it was always a bit of a struggle to get journalists to look at social issues in the country. They just wanted to look at the politicians. Now I really feel that things have changed, things have turned, and very few of the entries to the competition were about strictly political matters. They were about topics that matter to ordinary people. So that's my promotion for the prize winning tomorrow, but also for the career of being a journalist in Georgia, which I think is thriving. Now let me move on to the topic you're expecting to hear me talk about, fake news. Before I do so, how many of you understand reasonably much English? Anyone? Okay, that helps me. Oh, a lot of you. And Russian? Okay, that's very helpful, because I'm going to make some fine definitions, and I've got at least one handout in English you might be interested in. I chose the topic because it's much discussed in my country, in the United States. I mean, my country and the United States. I'm not from the United States. Both in journalism school, but also amongst the journalist community. Fake news. It's almost like the expression were invented for the American presidential elections. But the problem with fake news is it means different things to different people. If you're Donald Trump or his press secretary, fake news is news that he doesn't like. And whilst I don't condone that use, fake news for news that you don't like, I can understand it. After all, it took quite a long time for the media in America to take Donald Trump seriously. Until the day before he won, they were not predicting his election. Similar happened in Britain. Till the day before our referendum in June last year, the press were not expecting British people to vote to leave the European Union. We got it wrong, and we might as well admit it. We gave too much emphasis in our media reporting to statistical data, opinion polls that proved to be inaccurate. When I worked for the BBC, one thing that was drummed into us, don't give prominence to opinion polls. They are predictions, and they're usually wrong. So I think some of us journalists got those two important voting occasions last year badly wrong, and we need to learn some lessons from it. Another use of fake news, for news that hasn't been properly checked and cross-checked by journalists who forgot the golden rule of journalism. What's the golden rule of journalism? The golden rule of journalism, according to me, is be accurate. You are nothing. You are not a journalist if you're not accurate. How you do that? Yes, I could speak for half an hour on how you do that. But the most basic is check, check, and recheck. Another absolute rule from the BBC rulebook. Never broadcast unverified news. Or, we've modified it a bit now, if you're not sure, then be careful to attribute it. Otherwise, you, the journalist, or the BBC, get blamed if it turns out to be wrong. Okay, third definition of fake news, and this is the most worrying one, is what we used to call disinformation. In other words, deliberately made up news distortion, news that is not based on facts. And this is what's worrying a lot of journalists these days, because it's harder to differentiate true journalism, facts that have been verified, from fake journalism, which we could also call propaganda. So I've introduced the words we used before somebody came up with fake news: disinformation, propaganda, unverified news, even rumor. The key here is how easy or how difficult it is to recognize, both for you as trained journalists, but also for the general public who are not equipped. They don't know that what they read on Facebook is probably wrong. In Britain, in our print media, for example, we draw a clear distinction between news, or if you look on another page, it might be called national or international, but anyway, news, and what am I going to find next? Comment. Comment is opinion. You don't have to verify. But that doesn't entitle you to depend on what we read on the news page, we assume has been verified as news. At least two sources, for example, depending on eyewitness, other rules that we use to determine whether something is true or not. The problem we're facing is that sometimes comment and news is mixed. I want to give you one or two of my favorite quotes on this topic. A former editor of the Guardian newspaper, I think I have a Guardian, C.P. Scott, he's a famous editor, when this paper was called the Manchester Guardian, he said, and we often quote this, "Comment is free, but facts are sacred." If I bring this a bit closer to home, you know the famous joke about the Russian media, do you? That there's no news in Pravda and there's no truth in Izvestia. Can someone say that in Russian for me, please? Call it a joke, but there's an underlying point in that joke about what is truth. By the way, I can also make a joke of the first one I gave you, when I said comment is free, but facts are sacred. If you understand the double meaning of free in English, the present-day editor will say, facts are free, comment is expensive. I hope you understand that. Because the columnist, the commentator, gets paid a big fee, the reporter only a small fee. But please remember the first one, not the jokey one. Comment is free, but facts are sacred. And one more quote, and this is a challenge for you. Who can tell me who said, the hero of my, which famous writer, who said, the hero of my story is truth? Okay, think about it. You get the answer at the end. I'm hoping someone will get there first. The hero of my story is truth. I will only tell you that you know of the person I'm thinking about. How do we cope with fake news? I've told you already that it's a regular topic in our newspapers. And I read a very interesting column, so that's a comment, in the Times just about 10 days ago. 3 tests to help Google flag fake news sites. It's written by a well-known journalist writing for The Economist. And if I say The Economist, I hope that immediately says to you, trustworthy news. By the name of Ed Lucas. He's a Russian speaker, as it happened. And when I first knew him, he was the BBC's correspondent in the Baltic states. And he's made a recent study of disinformation, propaganda, fake news, especially in this part of the world. Let me read you the start of the article. Dealing with fake news is as tricky as defining it. When many mainstream news outlets publish horoscopes and take homeopathy seriously, why should we expect everything else to be completely accurate? Or as he puts it, pro-Kremlin positions backed by invented facts and distorted arguments hardly stand out. The dividing line between true news and fake news, or true news and opinion, is becoming harder. In newspapers, we may always signal it, just as I've shown you. Opinion. In newspapers, but how do we cope on the web? Of course, you all know that you never trust something that you read on Facebook or social media in general. Right? But what about if you're looking at what seems to be a serious website, like one he mentions here, I forget what it stands for, CGS Monitor. I think it's the Center for Global Security. Ed Lucas has looked in more detail, and he says it's a Kremlin front, and he tells the story of how he worked that out. He mentions another site, which he says was specifically set up by Russia to back the breakaway region of Transnistria. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? If it happens for Transnistria, then it could equally happen for some other. Now, don't get me wrong, I've not come here to knock Russia. I work a lot in Russia myself, and I've got a high regard for Russian journalists. What I have come here is to try to understand or try to discuss with you how we can, in this modern age, sift real news, real facts from fake news and disinformation. Ed Lucas gives us some good pointers in that direction. If you don't trust a site, look at who is behind it. If you can't find out, for example, there's no ownership, there's no address, there's no email, don't trust it. Here I'm not just talking something that might have originated in Russia, something that might have originated anywhere. We equally could have had a propaganda site in Britain promoting exit from the European Union, for example. And who invented the fake news that said that Pope Francis backs Trump's candidacy for president? We can't assume that was created in Russia. It was probably created in America. It just reinforces another important rule in journalism. Always be skeptical about what you are being told. What is his motive for telling me this? Trying to persuade me to vote to exit the European Union? Or trying to persuade Americans to vote for Mr. Trump? His second lesson, or I think he calls it the third lesson, is also interesting for testing a website. How do they deal with corrections? If you go to the BBC website and you think something is wrong, there is a procedure for asking for a correction. In The Guardian, every day there is corrections and clarifications. And by the way, sometimes it goes even for half a column. Only 2 items today. The Times has one as well. Wall Street Journal. By the way, these are for one day. Everything I'm showing you is from one day, Friday last week. Wall Street Journal, corrections and amplifications, slightly different use of word. By saying clarification or amplification, we're not saying we're wrong, we might be. Nobody likes to admit to making a mistake. But if you see a newspaper with a corrections column, does it increase your trust in that newspaper or decrease it? Increase, I hope. Certainly for me. A willingness to admit mistakes. So look for that. If you find a website you distrust, does it have a procedure for corrections? By the way, are you following the French elections, the French presidential elections at all? More or less. In other words, not very much. You might have noticed, let me just give it to you in simple journalistic terms. Until 2 weeks ago, the front runner was Monsieur Fillon. Now he is the subject of a scandal that he employed his wife on a high salary, but she didn't have a proper job, nothing to do. And also 2 of his children who were trainee lawyers at the time. Approximately €1 million. Sounds like a scandal, doesn't it? Okay, it came out in a very respected French newspaper, Le Canon Enchaîné, which is doing good journalism, basically. Specializes in investigations. So I and most other media are inclined to believe it. And I read today that the police are now involved in the investigation. What has it done to his poll rating?
Actually, he apologized to French.
Yes, he's more or less admitting it. So he's gone from number 1 in the opinion polls to number 3. Fake news or proper journalistic investigation? I think it's evident, isn't it? Proper journalistic investigation. He has a case to answer. So now Monsieur Macron has gone to the top of the list. He's a bit of an independent figure, quite young, And he's topping the polls at the moment. What did you learn about Monsieur Macron?
He's got a wife who's 24 years old.
Yes, but this is true. He has a wife who is 24 years older. And after that, what else do we read? And he has a gay lover. Now, as journalists, do you believe this? That's a fact. That's a fact. His marriage is a fact. But does he have a gay boyfriend? I mean, does he have a boyfriend on the side? I don't know. I can only tell you this story has been around for 2 or 3 weeks, but it only got into the quality newspapers last week, Thursday, I think, when he denied it. Do we believe it? Have I got the point across? Be skeptical. It may be true, it may not be true. But at the time of election when you have to have your antennae quivering, and my advice to you is if you have information like that, assume it is fake. I don't know what it'll do to the polls in France. Will it increase his standing or decrease his standing? But I can only tell you that if it decreases, then the next story will be about Marine Le Pen, who will become #1. There is already a story that she is borrowing a lot of money from Russian banks. Maybe we'll read next week that she has a love child. How hard it is to be a journalist today. Please take these as lessons. Let me try and summarize. I hope these might be good lessons for you in your future careers. Apart from what I said already about always be skeptical about information that is freely offered. You could make that #1. The golden rule, we are nothing if not accurate. #3, draw a clear distinction between fact and opinion. Of course, I should say draw a clear distinction between news and fake news. And for that, I remind you of those 2 basic tests, lessons from Ed Lucas. Verify the website if you can. And if you can't, don't trust it. Another lesson from there, deal with mistakes honestly. Admit them and correct them. That is a characteristic of a good journalist. Bad journalists don't make mistakes. I mean, bad journalists don't admit to making mistakes. And finally on my list, exposing fakery is itself a growth industry in journalism. One day's newspapers, I told you. The Times tells us public cash is paying for the growth of fake news. It shows how well-respected organizations find their adverts are being put on fake websites or websites of disreputable organizations like ISIS. Okay, that's one example. Another, in the Financial Times, this is another case of good journalistic investigation. The man that Mr. Trump intends to appoint as ambassador to the European Union has distorted his CV. He lives and works in Britain, and he said he was created a knight, a sir. He became sir. And Mrs. Thatcher, former Prime Minister, said some nice things about him. Okay, that's fake news on the part of this individual, but it's good journalism on the part of the newspaper. Here in The Guardian, there's an article about Shaltai Boltai. Does that ring any bells with you? Distrusted Russian website, and one of the men who worked for it. So, exposing fake news is a growth industry for journalism, and there is always a role for good investigative journalism. I have just 3 copies of that Ed Lucas article if you want to share it around or make further copies. English speakers amongst you. You can copy it. I recommend it. It's very good. It's a paywall. You might not get it on. No. And finally, what's the answer to the question? Who said the hero of my story is truth? Well done. Say for the whole class. Leo Tolstoy. Okay, you think of him as a novelist. But before he was a novelist, he was both a soldier at the Crimean War, and he wrote 3 famous essays, which was early journalism, were published in Moscow. And if you are interested in war reporting, I recommend reading them. The Sevastopol Sketches is the title in the English edition. I'm sure you can get a Russian edition. And the quote I'm referring to comes at the End of the second of the 3 essays. Thoroughly recommended. After I seem to be a bit critical about contemporary Russia, it's very nice to draw on a classical Russian as one of my favorite journalistic quotes. I spoke for longer than I intended. I apologize, but I hope we still have some chance to discuss. If you were editing your evening news bulletin, your Moambi or whatever the Rustavi 2 equivalent is, critique, is it? What would you include? Would you include show business? Would you include sport? Or would you strictly confine it to what we conventionally regard as news? I can only tell you that editors these days take a much wider view of news than when I was in this role. All those topics I've mentioned, sport and anything to do with arts and celebrities, I would allow a very short period at the end of the news bulletin. But now, BBC has 24-hour news. You have to put all these other things in to fill the 24 hours. Last night I was watching the British Oscars, the BAFTAs. It was all driven by personalities, quick interviews with film stars. In my day that wasn't news, but nowadays, who can say? Indeed, indeed, and it's all about selling newspapers and selling news channels. Until 8 months ago, my biggest worry was coping with the increasing volume of information which is available to us as journalists. Not just on the internet, even on my laptop hard disk and my own hard drive, so many things I've stored away that I'll never have any chance of finding. Now my major worry has changed, and it's what I've been discussing with you, sorting truth from fake, real information from manufactured information. And I only thought about this at the British referendum. We're used to politicians telling lies. That's what they do for a living. But journalists are meant to investigate claims and such forth. And now it's harder and harder. Did fake news change the result of the British referendum or the American presidential election? Answer, quite possibly, but we never will know. Likewise, French elections and future elections, wherever. Your second point, what action should we take to stop social media? I think this is broadly your point. Stop social media dispensing fake news. An article I didn't quote earlier, from Article 19, the organization that supports press freedom, says we can't ban fake news. But I agree with this. We should expose it and be aware of it, and even write pieces like this in our media to warn the general public to be careful of what they read on social media. I told you, exposing fake media is a growth industry in journalism. Well, the Times, in the 2 examples I've given, the Financial Times, traditional media. One of the categories in the prize tomorrow is for, or 2 of the categories are for good investigative journalism. I don't remember who published the prize winners, and I wouldn't be telling you now anyway. But there is an example of media in Georgia supporting investigation. By the way, I'm going to give you one more reference if you want to follow it up. I saw a very good report on Channel 4 News in Britain last week, Thursday, I think. It's on YouTube. You can look at it if you want. I checked this morning. You search fake news Google searches. If you, the reporter shows, if you type in something like, it's all about the auto search. You know what I mean by auto predict. I think she typed in homosexuality. An auto search came up with is a sin. Homosexuality is a sin. So it's leading you in a certain direction. Then she tried Holocaust, and the first 2 or 3 suggested sites were to do with Holocaust denial. Ed Lucas also refers to this, and he says Google and Facebook, no, Google he's talking about, have already made some adjustments. An example he gives is, I'm sorry, another social problem of our times, free child porn. You can imagine what someone who types this is looking for. Now the algorithm has been adjusted, and you get stories about people being arrested for child molestation. So here is an example of Google adjusting rather than promoting or helping promote something. That's not quite fake news, but it's similarly related. And another example, how to commit suicide. Instead of giving you an answer to that question, you're given a telephone number for Samaritans. Does that make sense? You know, I'm not saying social media should stop this or stop that. We need to adjust to the age we live in and find solutions to the problems. And the problem of today is fake news. When I was a young journalist, we did all the fact-checking ourselves. You wouldn't dare to submit something to an editor unless you were sure you'd got your facts right. Now, journalism is moving so far and so fast that big organizations and even not so big organizations contract out their fact-checking. It doesn't matter how you get things right. If that's the best way to do it in this day and age, then it's surely helpful to lift the quality of journalism. Indeed, to protect our profession, that may be part of the question you were asking me, to protect our profession and make people realize the importance of having journalist-verified news rather than easily available social media news. While I was preparing my thoughts this morning, I just did a bit of searching. There are fact-check websites, but there are also, like BuzzFeed, sites that are exposing fake news. You know, the 15 biggest items of fake news in the past year. There's lots of sources for those things. So regard internet as a tool. It's a threat, but it's also a very valuable tool. I've been asked since I came here, do we need a public broadcaster? What is wrong with the public broadcaster? Why is it cancelling its programs? Now, you wouldn't expect me to give my opinions on the present state of GPB, though it saddens me. So I will only say this, that in my country, the public broadcaster is an important pillar of our democracy. Number two, it sets standards in broadcast journalism. Well, actually, in Britain, we have at least 3 public broadcasters, but it's true I'm thinking mainly of BBC. Okay, so I said, number one, it's a pillar of democracy. Number two, it sets the standards that others follow. Number three, it's the only broadcaster that by law must serve all the people, including minorities, all sectors of society. Where have I got to? Because after all, it belongs to all the people. That's the point. I won't go into the finance structure, but everybody who uses the BBC has to pay. So I've given you, was it 3 or 4? I can't remember. And I will say 2 other things in Britain that are very helpful. By law, no broadcaster may have an opinion. The BBC doesn't have an opinion. It shows a lot of people who do, but the channel itself may not have an opinion. Anchors may not express their opinions. Indeed, we must conceal our opinions. Did I ever tell you whether I supported Brexit or not Brexit? No, I didn't. So that's what I mean by neutrality, and that applies to any program presenter. So no opinion and complete transparency of ownership for all media. Specifically, no political organization or religious organization may control television or radio. So, please draw your own conclusions. I know your broadcasting law 2004 quite well, and it's a good law. For some reason, the implementation has never been as good as it should be. Enough. Or you'll think I'm promoting BBC. Okay, thank you very much for listening so carefully.
We are waiting for you.
I hope it's been helpful.
Invited for tomorrow.
Okay.